Today I'm going to be answering questions from you, my audience. Every once in a while I like to throw up a post that says, hey, if you have a question, I'd love to answer it for you. And I got some great questions. I picked out a couple of them from various social media platforms, and that's what we're going to do in this video. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written like 22 books, and I make these videos because there are a lot of bad books out there, and I don't want yours to be one of them. So let's talk about what questions you had for me, and hopefully through my answers, you're going to gain some value. You're going to be able to put your writing journey into perspective. But let's jump right into it. The first question is, how are you able to turn out such interesting stories so quickly? Well, it's very kind to say that my stories are interesting, and I'm really glad that whoever wrote the question is enjoying them, and hopefully you're enjoying them too. If you didn't know, I just released book number 6 in the Battle Mage Farmer series, Preservation. It's out. People seem to be loving it. You should definitely give the series a try if you haven't already. But if you're reading along, definitely pick that one up. But enough self-promo. Let's get back to the question. How do we churn out interesting stories really quickly? And the answer is you just practice more than is probably good for your health. And that's what I did. I just practiced for years and years and years. And interestingly enough, my practice started before I started actually writing. And it started with reading. I actually began this whole journey with reading as many interesting stories as I could. And not just reading them, but taking them apart, trying to understand what it was about them that I loved so very much. And after I had done that, after I had generated an understanding of what I loved about a story, I would spend hours thinking about those stories and thinking about what I could do differently or what I would have liked to see in those stories. And then when I started writing in like 2015, I applied all of that knowledge and all of that understanding of sort of story structure to what I was writing. And I was incredibly aggressive about getting feedback for my stories so that I could know what to improve. If you've hung around this channel for any length of time, you've probably heard me say this. There's one single most important question that you can ask, and that is, what is one thing I can do better? And that's what I did. I just asked that question over and over and over again. And eventually I got to the point where I developed a sort of instinctive understanding for what would make a story good. Now, that isn't to say that my stories are without their flaws or that they're perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Instead, they're just tuned. They're tuned to a specific kind of reader, a specific kind of audience. That reader and that audience happen to also be me. So really, the short answer to your question is, I just write what I like. And as long as you do that, you're probably going to be able to churn out interesting stories as well. I have a very strict policy that if I'm writing something and it starts to get boring for me to write, I make a change. Because if it's going to be boring for me to write, it's going to be boring for somebody else to read. And we don't want any of that. So hopefully that answers your question as to why I'm able to write interesting books at a relatively fast pace. And that brings us to question number 2. Question number 2. How did you come up with the lore for Novaterra? So this is actually pretty interesting. And in this question, there was a whole series of different questions, and I'm going to try to sort of wrap them all up and answer them for you using this single question of how did I come up with the lore? The reality is that all of those ideas were just sort of floating around in my head, and more of them are archetypes or tropes than specific flashes of inspiration. What do I mean by that? I mean that I just started with a relatively simple premise. I built my core concept for what I wanted the world to feel like. I set some boundaries so that I knew where I was going to be coloring, and then I just started exploring. And as I developed different pieces of lore, I just slotted them in to make sure that they fit with the core concept and they stayed inside the boundaries. This is a really simple world building trick, and I've talked about it in other videos. In fact, I'll link down below a video where I specifically talk about this world building strategy. And the reality is that you can use it for lore as well. What is my intent with what I'm trying to communicate to my reader? Well, I just pick my core concept. What do I want them to feel? I pick the boundaries. Where am I going to draw the lines around this? And then I fill it in. And that's what I did for all of my lore. So when I originally started, I didn't do a lot of pre-building. In fact, there came a point, I believe it was in the 4th book, Guardian, where I had to stop what I was doing and I had to take a full 2 weeks to get my head around all of the different pieces of lore that I had created and understand how they fit in the grander scheme of things. But I didn't do that until after the fact. I wrote the first 3.5 books before doing that. I know based on comments that the lore in Novaterra is something that people really like. And again, I think it's because it's all tropey. Typically, when we use the term trope, there's sort of a negative connotation to it. It means sort of tired. It means often done. It means stale. But the reality is that humans operate in tropes. We understand patterns, and we see them everywhere we go. And when we recognize a pattern, it does something in our brain. It brings us a sense of comfort, and it allows us to shortcut the processing of new information. Well, that's really, really helpful if you're building lore, because I can give somebody a trope and they instantly understand what I'm trying to communicate, which means that I can just drip pieces of information throughout the story and build a complex web of lore without getting stuck in the weeds of it. And what's fascinating is that despite there being very little information when it actually comes down to it about the lore in Novaterra, people feel as if it's this complete comprehensive world. And I would argue that you don't need more than that. And I would argue that that's actually better than having something that is completely solidified and concrete, because it gives people the ability to adjust the lore slightly to suit their preference. And so a lot of people can all enjoy the same thing, even if they have slightly different preferences in the way they like to think about lore. So that got a little bit technical, but the point is this. When I set out to create the lore for Novaterra, it was with a blank slate. I had a very light sense of where I wanted to go, but for the most part, I just explored. I just figured it out as I went along, always keeping that core concept of what do I want my reader to feel and keeping my boundaries so that I knew I was always coloring inside the lines to create that sense of immersion. All right, here's the next question. And this sort of piggybacks on the previous question. Did you plan ahead for the Titan series? Well, the answer to that is yes. I planned meticulously for a 3-book series. Anybody who's read the Titan series knows that it is not 3 books. Novaterra spans 10 books, and while the first and second book follow the storyline I laid out, the 3rd book sort of started to deviate, and by sort of I mean a lot, and then things just sort of spiraled out of control. I'm a pantser, and so I like to let my characters just sort of explore the world, and I like to explore it with them. And a weird thing happened in that there were just new things to see and new pieces of lore to explore, and the story just changed. It wasn't what I originally intended. And a good thing, too. The story that I had written down, I actually went back and looked at my notes not too long ago, and it wasn't great. It just wasn't interesting in the same way that Nova Terra is interesting. And I think that's because I was focusing more on the plot in my notes and less on the characters. And if you've read the Titan series, you know that Nova Terra is all about the relationships between the people. That's what it is. It's about adventure and growing together as a group. And I think I would have missed all of that if I had followed my original plan. So I'm a huge fan of just trying things and seeing how they turn out. And I'm not against planning. In fact, I think that it's probably a good idea. But I do like giving my stories space to just exist, to breathe, to see where they're going to go. The next question I got was, what is the hardest aspect of writing the Titan series? Most of these questions were specifically about the Titan series because I got a lot of them from the Nova Terra Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, you're welcome to join. You get news and stuff there about what I'm doing in the Titan series, the Tower series, and in Nova Terra as a world. But I'm going to take this question and expand it into all of my series. What is the hardest thing about writing a series? And the answer to that is very clear, in my head at least. It's scope creep. Sometimes you start with a really cool idea, and things just get out of hand. And you make decisions that are cool in the moment, but then make it much harder to write the next book. And I've experienced this with every single series that I've written. It's very hard to keep something tightly contained, especially in fantasy, especially in lit RPG. This is where the term progression in progression fantasy comes from. It's this idea that things are growing and expanding always. And I find that most of the stories that I write follow that same journey, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I just sort of like that expansive world and universe and that style of storytelling. And so all of my stories just end up getting much bigger than I originally anticipated, which is fine. It's then hard to write the next book in the series because things have gotten bigger and wilder and more out of control. It also doesn't help that I write OP protagonists. So my protagonists are overpowered, and they typically have fewer challenges in terms of direct conflict than most other main characters. And so because of that, it can be difficult to ensure that there's sufficient challenge in the story for them. So I would say that that scope issue is probably the thing that I have the hardest time with. And that's true for Nova Terra, that's true for the Titan series, that's true for the Tower series, that's true for Battlemage Farmer, it's true for Dreamer's Throne, which is coming out on September 22nd. The first book is releasing, and it's true for Soulcaller, which is a series that's coming out next year. And that brings us to our last question. And that question was, hey, what's coming out when? And that is a great question. So, like I said, we just released Battlemage Farmer number 6, Preservation. That should be available in ebook. Audiobook doesn't come out, I think, until next year. The audiobook for number 5, I think, drops in November, and then number 6 will be next year. But books 7, 8, and 9 are coming out in the Battlemage Farmer series, and they'll probably come out in 2024. So what else is going on? Well, Arcanist, book 3 in the Tower series, comes out on the 6th of September. So that's like 2 weeks from when I'm recording this. And then Dreamer's Throne 1 comes out on the 22nd of September, which is like 4 weeks from when I'm recording this. Almost exactly a month, actually. And then beyond that, I'm not super sure when everything is going to come out, but I've already finished the Tower series book 4, and I've already finished Dreamer's Throne book 2 and 3, and so those will be coming out at some point over the next 6 to 12 months, along with Soulcaller 1, 2, and 3 will probably all come out next year. And I've been also working on a couple of new projects for next year as well. So exciting times. There are a lot of books that are going to be coming out between now and this time next year. Anyway, I hope you got some insight from the answers to those questions. If you have any other questions, definitely leave them in the comments and I'll try to get to them as I can.